first, thank you very much to the inspiring speakers we had been hearing so far. So there were a number of aspects which were really inspiring to me. Just introduce briefly our work. At Darmstadt University of Applied Sciences. We work there in the Soundscape and Environmental Media Lab, and we working since 2012 with 3D audio. We entered 3D audio by working within, or by producing 3D audio tracks for full dome media, for full dome films. That was our first contact with 3D audio, but then we very, very quickly came to producing independent and autonomous, what you call, of course, autonomous audio productions here. Oh,
Yeah, so
and and our works we are producing in our Soundscape and Environmental Media Labs, they range from electroacoustic and mainly soundscape composition to ear plays, radio art, to sound art. So I think I have to say that because we will not only talk about what traditionally is called music, whatever that means. We all know that this is a very, very broad term, but we will also touch other genres here, genres which are related and which are very close and which can also be produced in 3D audio, and I will talk a little bit about that. So let me talk first about some, as I say, some skeptics' thoughts, talking about immersive sound as something related to the future and to its technologies seems to be, as the linguists would say, a pleonasm, an unnecessary redundancy and doubling, and is therefore, or could therefore be considered as mildly absurd. As sound waves unfold spherically in space, creating by this a genuine environmental experience, they are literally immersive by nature. And two, it goes without saying, I think, that besides being immersive per se, sound is always related to three-dimensional space and plastic physicality. At this point, and inspired by Milena Drumeva, I would like to suggest making a clear distinction between sound and audio. Whereas the term sound comprises all auditory entities, the term audio signifies the auditory which is distributed by a technical apparatus. Since 1877, when the phonograph was invented, the recorded auditory environment was reproduced, or one could even say more figuratively, was pressed through one single sound funnel, a quite simple and mechanic loudspeaker. As it is well documented, people were stunned by what they considered to be an authentic and true sound experience. And 8 decades later, the recorded sounds were able to exit through two much more sophisticated loudspeakers, stereo as they wanted to call it, claiming an even heightened authenticity and truth, and at the same time accompanied by a lively aesthetic debate driven by German Hörspiel artists, during which representation, illusion, and figuration were critically reviewed from an artistic point of view and were not at all considered artistically satisfying aims and categories, but simply euphoric paraphrases of an entertainment technology industry. And by the way, from this debate emerged a new movement. First, what you called das neue Hörspiel, the new Hörspiel, and a bit later, the so-called Ars Acustica, which expanded beyond the genre of Hörspiel towards an overall radio art and then auditory media art. But back to the loudspeakers. With every multiplication of loudspeakers, this claim for truth and authenticity was repeated. Today, again, in the face of 3D audio, we are exposed to the industry's same rhetoric, truth and heightened authenticity, as they say. This in combination with terms like virtual reality and augmented reality, and by this implying and favoring realism and illusion-based aesthetic approaches. Currently, audio immersion technologies are clearly linked to the latter, and I haven't perceived yet a different type of discourse. So the current aesthetic debate about 3D audio tends to be a quite narrowed down, an ahistorical debate, which I think is neither satisfying nor very critical. Probably, I think, but however, I have heard since this morning a number of very promising attempts to tackle this critical approach. Again, thank you to my predecessors speaking here. Okay, so I don't want to talk about the theory of artistic research, so just skip that here. I think that it is worth applying historical perspectives in order to understand 3D audio, as it will frame and enlighten the artistic spectrum of 3D audio, its implication and how to overcome them. And I'll refer during the course of my talk to a number of historical predecessors, and yeah, you will of course hear that. First of all, to implement the plasticity of audio has been a continuous artistic desire in the 20th century contemporary music and sound art. I will later show that we of course trace it back much longer, but it has been a very, very prevalent topic during the 20th century. Just remember the Philips Pavilion at the 1958 Brussels World Fair with its more than 300 loudspeakers. Remember the Akusmonium, Stockhausen's and Nono's numerous spatial settings, and the many sound art installations by artists such as Kubisch, Leitner, Fontana, and of course many more, involving a large number of speakers arrayed variously in space for a precisely positionable sonic plasticity, that is a desire to arrange sounds along an X, Y, and Z axis in a 360-degree sphere, or maybe to be more precise, in a 180-degree sphere. This artistic desideratum is distinct from multi-channel and surround sound arrangements in which sounds are reproduced along a line of speakers and projected in space. 3D audio, as we understand them and we practice is something significantly different than that. However, the production of the before-mentioned famous settings has always involved complicated superstructures. Newly available systems allow us to implement 3D audio with significantly less effort and greater technological and oral precision. And our lab at the Hochschule Darmstadt is working since 2012 with the spatial sound wave system by the Fraunhofer Institute, just to mention it. Of course, we know there are a few other different systems around as well, which are equally interesting, but that's the system we are working with. So important is, I think, for our approach, the term soundscape became a central paradigm for our 3D audio conceptualization. We are basing our approach on this idea as an auditory gestalt and a figure of thought. The concept of soundscape makes clear that 3D audio is not some new technological gimmick, but rather a distinct and coherent aesthetic concept. Soundscape, as I'm sure you know, is a clearly defined term coined by the Canadian composer Murray Schafer. It merges sound and landscape and designates the sounding landscape. The idea of soundscape is originally focused on sculptural three-dimensional positioning and movement of sounds in 360-degree sphere. Sounds are located at specific places in the landscape in which they take their positions, taking on proportion and three-dimensional form, be they moving or motionless. Soundscape studies provide us with categories of analysis of a three-dimensional audio space. There are the following terms which indicate specific roles of sound in a 3D audio environment. Those who are familiar with soundscape studies, they might know these terms. There is a very important term which is called keynote sound, a continuous sound characteristic for an environment's identity with a grounding and undercoating function. For example, the hum of the Autobahn, which you might hear from your apartment, or the specific sound of the sea and the breaking waves at a certain section of the beach, the rattle of leaves in a park during windy weather, or the characteristic static of a vinyl record. So that was the term keynote sound. There's another term by which you can analyze a 3D audio space quite well. This is the term sound mark. Similar to landmark, it is a characteristic single sound which represents the identity of a certain place. A very good and maybe too good example is the Big Ben sound in London, or there would be also the famous sound of a Mercedes-Benz car door, or the trailer music of the Tagesschau. But of course, it could be less semantic and less related to reality, of course. It can be established, and by this you would then create an artistic or artificial, or whatever you want to call it, sound mark. Whereas the sound marks happens in the moment, the keynote sound unfolds in duration. Then there is another term, sound signal, quite similar to the previous sound mark. It is clearly semantically charged and related to an imperative. You are supposed to do something if you hear a sound signal, as a sound signal indicates emergency and it urges you to give way to something or to do something. And beyond that, they are very different in every country if it comes, for example, to police sirens or telephone rings or something like that. The post horn is another example, also the hunting horn, the bugle, which has a considerable sound repertoire, signifying situations which can occur during a chase. Not often heard nowadays. The telephone ring, I mentioned already, the auditory reactions of machines, sounds of email arriving, sounds of the computer rejecting an input, and so on. And it goes without saying that the semantic content, and therefore the degree to which a sound is a sound signal, depends very much on the situational context the sound occurs and to the overall cultural context the sound is received in. There are other useful categories which stem from the soundscape terminology and contribute to analyzing a 3D audio environment. Just to mention briefly here, because of the time, hi-fi environment and lo-fi environment as defined by the soundscape studies, or, quite important, the distinction between a point source and a planar source, the extension of a source in space, relating this to the movement of a sound, which is a hologrammatic aspect, you could even say. So the idea of soundscape thus offers specific and plausible approaches to the three-dimensional shaping of sounds. At this point, I'd like to refer to the specifics of our 3D audio apparatus, as I said, the spatial sound wave system we're working with, because it entails the sculptural positioning of sound in space. 3D audio can be described as an auditory hologram. This makes it an object of particular fascination. Space here is not conceived as something existing that must be filled with sound, but rather constituted topographically as a three-dimensional entity by means of sound. As a result, we perceive it as we do a landscape, agile and multi-perspectively. In this way, we can both reproduce specific existing sonic landscapes and compose imaginary sculptural worlds of sound. One of the technological features or strengths of our system is that it's not channel-based, but based on virtual speakers, on audio sources that can be then positioned in 3 dimensions as desired, independently from the position of a real material loudspeaker. Another important aspect is that our system does not provide a privileged position for the listener. It has no sweet spot. So the question of aesthetic necessity is the maybe central aspect of our artistic research. In quite a number of 3D audio productions which have been realized so far all over the world, I want to say, to date, the execution of the three-dimensional aspect has tended to be rather lackadaisical. Think of stereo productions by pop bands converted to 3D or stereo radio plays also converted to 3D. The listener finds him or herself in the midst of the instruments or the vocally active individuals. It creates a wow effect, to be sure, but one thing, however, becomes clear: the use of 3D audio will never find fruition in the totting up of conventional frontal forms of presentation as 3D. What is called for, rather, is aesthetic necessity and specificity. By looking back at cultural history, we identified three basic categories which stand for specific dramaturgies, expressive needs, and characteristic forms of experience. First, we identified immersion and Eigenwelt, very clear, and I think this is not very difficult to find out. Implicit in the term immersion is the idea of what we would call in German Eigenwelt, a world in its own right, a concept with a long tradition. Richard Wagner, for example, described such an experience in which audience, artwork, surroundings, and artists coalesce as the basis for his Gesamtkunstwerk concept. Comparable is also the programmatic of the polychoral music of the Venetian school in the late 16th century, or the Hypogeum, a Neolithic era underground temple and burial structure in Malta, in which the voice of the priest is amplified and reflected in such a way that those present are surrounded by it, and the voice is traveling in space and is always creating a virtual kind of, let's say, embodiment, so to say. Again, what we think is so important about immersion is that it leads to creating worlds in its own right, Eigenwelten, self-contained artificial environments. Second, we identified tangibility and illusion to be a crucial specific category. With the help of 3D audio, sound scenarios and compositions can be created to experience an almost material or haptic presence. Sonic materials of all sorts can be physically sensed and felt in space. A gust of wind, for example. Materials we hear seem palpable, as seem the movements. Sound seems physical, corporeal, real, tangible. This too is a long-held idea, long-held desire, crystallized in the famous example of the amphitheater at Epidaurus, for example, where the sound of a coin dropped on the ground, so it is said, can be reliably heard, localized, and materially experienced even in the last rows, a reality duplicating oral experience far from a privileged sweet spot. Third, we identified the category virtuality and augmented reality, aiming at a characteristic form of 3D audio experience. The ear has the ability to sense where the eye cannot go, outside our field of vision and beyond our power of sight, behind us, for example, and in the dark. In this way, that which is absent can be made present, transcending material, and viewed from this perspective, the concept of virtuality has always been inherent to the auditory. One example of this is the oral experience of whispering galleries, such as those in the St. Paul's Cathedral in London or the Gol Gumbaz Mausoleum in Bijapur in India. In them, a quiet speaking voice can be heard at another location dozens of meters away as clearly as if the speaker had materialized directly besides the listener. It is not for nothing that such astonishing phenomena are sometimes credited with supernatural qualities. In the computer age, the interweaving of procedurally generated perceptions with the physically existing is known as augmented reality, but this term can retrospectively and legitimately also be used in the pre-electronic area as well. So we have also, a major point of our work is critic aesthetic reflections which arise from our artistic research with 3D audio. While cultural history offers us important artistic motivations for 3D audio, these do not necessarily meet our criteria of aesthetic legitimation. 3D audio's strong relation to illusion, realism, virtuality gave us cause to discuss whether and how one can escape an aesthetic of the illustrative, appropriative, or quasi-religious. We identified 3 main categories of critical approach and can outline them only briefly here. I have to drink a sip of water. It's very dry. Okay. So, 3 main categories of critical approach. The first is concepts of abstraction versus the naivety of illusionism and naturalism. 3D audio is fueled by a discourse which emphasizes and celebrates its capabilities of creating the auditory illusions of corporeal presence legitimated by its immersive characteristics. Illusionary artistic concepts, as for example naturalism or virtuality, have been legitimately criticized since the Baroque period and especially during the 20th century due to their delusiveness and their empathy-demanding mode of adoption. So the critics were really numerous. We found it therefore important to find artistic strategies which don't succumb to these all too obvious concepts. And let me give you an example. 2 years ago, the Canadian composer Barry Truax came to our 3D audio lab in order to adapt and rework his originally multi-channel soundscape composition Chalice Well to the 3D medium. In this piece, the principle of immersion is absolutely crucial. Being situated in a water spring, the listener is surrounded by its flowing, gurgling, fizzling, pulsating, and whirling. These sounds, however, are not presented as a naturalistic reproduction of specific acoustic. Ich sehe es nicht. Oh, das. I have to take a little bit longer, sorry. But through careful digital processing, in which sounds are subtly abstracted to evoke imaginings of physicality, materiality, surface feel, and movement beyond realism. I was told I get 25 minutes of talking time, and I had adapted to that. At the same time, they keep their connotative potential, their creative, subtle, semantic illusion, and the quality comes into being in following a fine line between abstraction and representational residues. Still, these sounds do not refer to conventional figurative concepts, although they communicate a strong physical presence. Another concept, another idea we want to approach critically is concepts of fragmentization and deconstruction versus the affirmative. By this artistic strategy, instead of trying to create a simulated acoustic likeness, the method here is to use the sound world to present an interior fragmentizing mirror and deconstructing reflection of the external world. And this is 3D audio used not as an instrument of homogeneously illusionary, rather as an approach for the torn, contrary, contrasting, and confrontational. Diverse sounds are positioned in space, creating something like a collage, but not really, leaving the materials, as it seems at least, dissimilar and unconnected. This is a strategy applied by a number of productions created in our lab. So there is another category which should be critically approached. This is concepts of internalization versus the naivety of being immersed by an outer world. And this implies to consciously understand the difference between a naive objectivism, which assumes that you perceive and take in what is outside of you, making by this the 3D environment a mere illustrative backdrop, and on the other hand, a sound experience which understands that it has already passed through the inner world of a protagonist or composer, or generally said, of a reflector. I make a little cut here and go to the next category. However, there is this special challenge of illusion and realism in case reality is required. We cannot turn our backs to the question how to deal with the requirements of auditory realism and illusionism. One of our major projects during the last years of our artistic research is our cooperation with Sony Music on the production of the second series of Die drei Fragezeichen and 3D audio. Die drei Fragezeichen are very popular, if not trivial, earplay series since the end of the 1970s, but produced by Sony Music. Its dramaturgy is simple, straightforward, supposed to draw the listener into the very illusion of realistic places and situations. Sony took for the second time the effort to produce it in 3D audio, the productions being accessible to the public in planetaria all over Germany, and by next week you can listen to them. You can listen to the piece where we worked the most on. It's available, also in Mannheim, by the way. There was already a first series which had been produced in 3D audio. However, although it had been done technically in a perfect way, it was considered dramaturgically not very perfect. When we were approached to work on the second series of a 3D production for Sony Music, we felt not only flattered but positively challenged. After listening to the first series, it became clear that artistic research is here required and not just mastering technological challenges. It was realized too that it's not enough to just position the sound in 3D space according to its naturalistic occurrence, as a lot of scurrilities would appear. For example, dialogues where participants would appear as inflated physical entities, as yetis, as we often said when we listened back to it. So this should not occur. And the same with the spoken word, actors with a spoken word attitude that would indicate that they have an intimate conversation. They were really, really inflated in the cupola. So that was kind of a very weird and big scurrility. Disproportional movements of sounds and voices within the cupola, which are driven by the wish to reflect the movement in reality, but then just end up in creating exaggerations. And there were also implausible or unmotivated silences and pauses between spoken word and or sound, most of them being too short as they were not adapted to the overall spatial settings of the scenarios, just to mention three major challenges. It's difficult to wrap up, but I'm wrapping up in a few sentences how we dealt with them. Let me just say this: the challenge of realism and illusion can be mastered by approaching scenes, atmos, and spoken word as a choreography, as we would say, which at the same time has to be concerned carefully with the question of proportion within an architecture by sound, as well as an electroacoustic composition, or we can even say a soundscape composition, balancing necessary semantic and dramaturgic plausibilities with abstracting and sensualizing strategies. Our motto became, we have to deform the so-called reality in order to create recognizability, and this always implies quite an amount of deconstruction. By realizing this and producing this, I dare say that we have taken the first crucial steps toward a production aesthetic of 3D audio. And if we look ahead, and I'm coming to my last sentences now, 3D audio is unlikely to remain a peripheral aesthetic phenomenon. With the growing success of computer-facilitated experiences of virtual spaces, games, and realities, it will quickly merge with the mainstream. Consequently, our aim is to accentuate aesthetic values and set specific compositional benchmarks, where the possibility of distancing ourselves is suspended, as it is in the immersive. We are presented with a challenge, not just to our auditory habit, but also to our informed and critical assimilation of the world. What kind of knowledge-oriented, aesthetically complex and simultaneously participatory listening would be required to keep the recipients from losing themselves in an affirmative posture of empathy, involvement and emulation? To be able to read, inhabit, play and master the 3D audio equipment, we will surely have to develop new methods of hearing and listening. Thanks very much.
So we have time for a quick question. Yeah, there.
Thank you, Sabine, for your talk. I just want to ask you whether you're optimistic about the imminent application of soundscape and all of the things you just described in the emerging industry of the autonomous vehicles, because this is where it seems that 3D audio is actually going, despite all of our experimentation as artists. But once an industry like the automotive industry, the amounts of money going on, billions in technology, they've actually nailed most of the nervous system of the vehicles, and are now turning towards what kind of sounds they're going to make in an urban environment. And I just wanted to get your opinion from where you are in the environmental media lab about the role of the composer, about artist research in such a significant development for sound. Well,
this of course can only be an estimation, but 15 years later I had been involved partly in corporate sound. First of all, I thought it was not interesting at all, but there were people who were really careful and interested. Of course, they were aiming at, that it's people buying and selling, I would say. But in the end, they were sticking to some principles. So my hope is, I'm a cultural person. Cultural persons always are based on hope, yeah? So my hope is that these type of persons will also be found in this car industry and wherever you apply this 3D audio things, yeah? But if we don't do as artists, if we don't really challenge them with quality demands and with, positioning ourselves, I think this will not work out. So if we are existing and there and bringing in our quality issues, I think the other side also cannot be unaffected by that. It's optimistic a little bit.